Welcome to today's edition of 22nd Century Management with Ken. And I have with me today as a guest a very interesting individual. John Hale is a safety expert and a storyteller. So you want to tell us a little bit more about that, John?
Well, like yourself, I'm a Air Force veteran, and I remember the chiefs would come to town, and they were the very experienced guys, the 25, 30 years guys and gals, and they would tell stories that would draw you in to make their point. And I always thought, man, that is the way to get the message across. And so when I started getting into a challenging job of the safety manager, I started doing the same thing and found stories really made the message stick.
Okay. And one of the things that you focus on in the safety side, but it's important in any business, is developing teams that work well together. So what do you think are some of the keys to do that?
Well, it really is all about engagement. And I love the many episodes that you have on your channel that talk about engagement and leadership, showing the way, and having that 1 minute manager principle of praising. Because really, we need to be able to show our workers the way and where to go, but also inspire them in what can be and what is potentially out there for them. A lot of times they just don't know, and we think that they know.
Yeah, I agree 100% with that. And I think that it is going to be so much more critical in the times we face right now and what the future looks like, because we've had a lot of the millennials have accelerated their exit from the workforce. So that's depleted the supply of, let's say, experienced people. I said millennials, I meant baby boomers. Sorry about that. And so what we have is we have a lot of job vacancies. And a good example of that is recently I've seen several strikes. And in the 10 years prior to that, I don't remember seeing a strike anywhere for anything, because everybody knew there were more people wanting jobs than there were jobs. Now it's just the opposite. There are more jobs than there are applicants. So trying to build a team where your people want to stay is critical. One of the statistics I saw that talks about millennials is average expectancy to remain in a job, 3 years. That's a tough way to go.
And when you take care of your people, they recommend the job that are open to their friends and their family. It's funny, I saw recently a couple people that left the company they were at because they were always complaining there's too much paperwork and there's too much safety procedures, and the inspector and the manager was watching over them. And then, like, not even 4 weeks later, they called back to say, can I have my job back? I think I'd rather work with a company that's so focused on my safety and on my success than this other company that just is flippant about so many things. And they realize the values of that kind of leadership and that management over workers that sometimes can seem overbearing to a young person.
Well, and that is especially true in companies that are high risk. Within any company, there are things that require attention to safety. You drive a company vehicle, you got to be safe about it. If you're lifting something, you got to be safe. So there's probably very few jobs. Even if you're handling paper, you got to make sure you don't get paper cut. So safety is paramount in a lot of industries. But I worked when I was in the Air Force. I worked on ground-based radar and the computers that supported them. And one of the radar installations I worked at, they had a klystron that was big enough you could walk inside it. And we had some guys that made mistakes that had tremendous consequences. The least of which was they disintegrated and literally dissolved the screwdriver that dropped into it. But one of the guys failed to observe all the safety procedures and wound up with a hole in his side where he had touched something and the arc exited through his side. So those kinds of things are critical. I'm sure you deal in construction, right?
Right. I work with high risk workers and a background in just like you're talking about manufacturing and utility work as well as construction. And it is very important to be very focused on what are the requirements. But it's an interesting thing, no matter what business you're in, whether in the service industry or some other kind of industrial activity, the principle of team members keeping their eyes on their fellow team members is so important. Even if you have very important clients that you're working with and you make a mistake on the phone, if you have a coworker next to you, you would hope that they'd say, wait a second, you just told them XYZ when really it's ZYX. And you say, oh, thank you for pointing that out. Oh, excuse me, you know what? I got that wrong. That might not be life-saving like in the construction industry or manufacturing, but it's still a very important team building element for success, is that we do have eyes on each other. Maybe another person takes a look at the report we're about to submit, things like that.
Yeah, I very rarely send something out in way of email unless it's just like a canned response that my wife doesn't lay her eyes on, because she will see things. And it's funny because, you mentioned, talked about that. Most of us, we write emails that are as clear to us ourselves as they can be. But sometimes somebody else gets it. Like I'll send my wife an email to look at. She'll be like, huh? What are you trying to say? So it's is a useful application of that, of getting other people to put eyes on your work. I love that. So what did you say are the keys for? So let's say that I'm going to start leading an organization, and what are some of the team key things that I could do to try to establish good communications, but to get the team to really work together?
Well, the idea of safety engagement is so critical. And that really takes an effort on the side of the leader to reach out and to involve people. You can't let people just kind of just coast and not get engaged in get involved. And so at the middle levels, they need to know their team members and reach out to them, and sometimes invite one of them to be the one that presents the next big project or something like that to the larger group, and let them be the one that get recognized and be praised. But is building up your team and letting other team members know that this isn't just a dead-end job. Maybe you feel like you're just sitting at the desk. You're a project manager, you're account, customer service person, and you don't feel like you're going anywhere. But you could show them how there are ways to move up and even start to give them little successes so they begin to see that ladder in front of them.
Okay. So now there are a couple of stories that are mentioned in your book, and so maybe you can share one or two that are examples of how to use stories to accomplish these kinds of things. I'm a huge fan of telling stories. I tell stories all the time in class when I'm teaching. So you had some were different than my stories.
And you know what? Part of that too is teaching managers and leaders how to tell a succinct story that helps to communicate the message. And usually I like to think of the word message, which is you start with a mess, the problem or the conflict, and with age, it becomes the message. So imagine, here's the situation. I tell this story. We were in South Korea in the Air Force, and my coworker was involved with us in this exercise where we had to wear the gas mask for almost 8 hours a day for 4 days that week. And it was getting on our nerves, but it was a critical combat ready task. And if one of us failed it, it's very possible that you would not be able to re-enlist and not be able to continue your career in the Air Force. Well, my coworker, and we're hiding under the desk playing war games, and we got all our gear on, and it's just very heavy outfit. And she starts to freak out, gets kind of claustrophobic, and she's ready to just rip this mask off of her face. And my coworkers and I all muzzled, and we're like, no, don't do it. And finally I remembered something. And I said to her, here, watch my finger. And I went back to when I was a kid, As a young person raising chickens, we read an article in the Mother Earth News of all magazines that talked about how to hypnotize a chicken. And you basically take their head and you make their head go down a line. And then when you set them back on their feet, they're stunned for a few moments. Well, with my friend, I kind of used that same idea. I put my finger in front of her mask and I had her follow my finger with her eyes and get her off of her anxieties. She calmed down. She passed and was able to continue her career. So that's just an example where, as a coworker, I was able to do something to help her not destroy the great thing that she had going. So telling a story like that, short as it may be, but quite dynamic and quite, has a big crisis there, that she could lose her job, her career. But then the people realize, oh yeah, I see what you're saying. We do need to look out for each other. And then they can think about how that applies in something that they do.
Okay, yeah, and it's interesting. I like to draw stories. I'm a huge on customer service, and so I tell a lot of customer service stories when I teach because, again, there's an old adage, and I love this. It says, "Facts tell, stories sell," and I think that's true for managers because as a manager, you're trying to communicate your desire or information that your audience needs to remember and needs to buy into. I guess is even more important. It's not that they remember it as much as they accept it and see why it's important. And so I think that again, the use of stories is really critical. And it's been interesting because I've had so many people on my podcast that talked about the use of story. So I have to ask, where in Korea were you?
I was in Osan, Korea, and I really enjoyed it. I'd heard terrible things about Korea before I went there, and I was like, oh my gosh. But you know what I did? When I got there, I found opportunities to volunteer in the community and volunteer in the military community, and I became a tutor of English to the South Korean military, and they taught me and my group of fellow airmen Korean. And then we went on field trips on the weekend. It was a wonderful, wonderful situation.
I was stationed at Kadena, and we used to, because you mentioned the chemical warfare gear, and we'd come up there to Gwangju, and they typically deploy the fighters up there, and then you lived in your chemical warfare gear or else you were back in the bunk, and it was not the most pleasant experience. I mean, again, I understood the importance of it, and I played the game, but it's kind of like mask wearing today. Mask wearing in the environment we in really important. So many people, don't for one reason or the other, but I'll get away from that. I didn't want to turn this political, but, used to that chemical warfare stuff. It was, I didn't know. When I was first in the Air Force, I worked on ground-based computers and things, and didn't realize that there was a real Air Force and then a not real Air Force. Because in my job, if it was alert, I fired up a radio and passed traffic to Vietnam. That's how far back I go. But yeah, see, there we go. More stories. So
and the funny thing is, stories don't have to be about the workplace. I was talking to my mom on the phone, and she started telling me this story about her trip to Hawaii, that she just loved her trip to Hawaii. She was telling me the story that she hadn't told me before. When I heard this story, I said, Mom, that's a great story. Can I use that when I'm teaching leaders? And she said, yes. Now, my mom passed away, but her memory lives on, and I'm able to use this story that she told me to illustrate the importance of keeping an eye out for your coworkers. So may I take a few minutes to just tell that story?
Sure, go ahead.
So there she is, her and her friends go to Hawaii, and there are all these seniors. So 3 of her friends and her are sitting on the beach, just enjoying the sun and the sand and the surf. And all of a sudden, this beautiful Aussie girl comes running up wearing her wetsuit, and it's like black and green. And my mom, being kind of a silly person sometimes, she looked up at her and she said, wow, are you a superhero? And in that Aussie accent, she said, aren't we all a little bit of a superhero? And she ran right out into the water with her surfboard. And later, my mom and some of her friends were out sticking their toes in the sea and just enjoying the nice warm water. When all of a sudden, when she had her back turned, this big wave came in and it knocked her down. And it didn't just knock her down; it started what do you call it? Rip tide, I guess,
Riptide.
and
Yeah.
pulling her out to the sea. And it was twisting, and she was rolling, and she couldn't get out. She couldn't stand up. All of a sudden, she was lifted up out of the water, and she was in the arms of that young woman, surfer girl, and brought right back out to the sand and sat down. And with just a quick salute, she was off back into the surf. And so she really was a superhero that day. And that's the kind of people we need, people that see something and take action. And then, my mom lived longer because of an Aussie surfer girl.
Yeah. That Aussie, we'll call her a superstar. Yeah. Superhero. Yeah, it's and again, like that's another example of a story that conveys a message. Like I said, it doesn't apply to any particular job or any particular thing, but it does convey the message that here's ways that you can really show your strength by helping others. And I think that that's true whether it's in a safety environment or just in the job environment. That in the most part, and one of the things that frustrates me, I guess, is in so many companies you see silos get built. Where you got this one team and it's their silo, and you're in a different team in a different silo, and people get aggravated if you try to help the other team. It's like, if you make a suggestion, and I'm like, it is very counterproductive when we're not willing to listen and learn from each other. In the copier world, it's the sales guys and the service guys a lot. And one of the things I encourage my service managers in the class is have their technician ride with a sales guy for half a day, and offer to let the sales guys ride with a tech for half a day, so that you start to understand the challenges they face and the things that might might at least give you some compassion. Because I'm here to tell you that most service guys couldn't go out and deal with doing cold calls for 4 hours. That knocking on that stranger's door and wanting them, trying to find a way to get them to do business with you would terrify them. But that's what the sales guy deals with all day. The sales guys would have a challenge dealing. They walk in, the customer's irate because the machine's broken. They got a job they need to get out, and so neither of them understand each other's job or the pressures they face. And so I think there's a lot to be said for that. Communication between departments.
That's right, because I think about that when I do have a copy technician come into our place when the machine's not working right, and you're frustrated, and you ask that technician, is this a good machine, or should I just dump it and get something new? That might be an opportunity for them to say, well, you know what? It is a little bit older, and you guys are really doing a heavy workload on this. I think you need to talk to Jim Bob, because he could probably tell you about why there's probably some better options for the rate and the amount of work you have with it. So before you know, that technician, by having just 10, 15% sales skill, can refer that customer back to be upgraded and actually to give them more value, the exact piece of equipment they need for their job.
Yeah, and that's a good example of it. And that's one of the things I encourage them to do is to help them learn to look for opportunities for the sales team. Of course, then the sales team's got to be receptive and act on them. So it is a challenge in that area. You probably have less of that in a safety environment, where people's lives are safe, because then they pay attention more. If it's just whether or not somebody gets a little extra money, it becomes maybe not as important.
Well, I would say, you know what? Make sure you do the job so that you can go home with all your fingers, eyes, and toes. Because if they don't follow procedures, people lose fingertips. People, they lose an eyeball if they're not wearing the eye protection or face shield like they should. So there's certain things that are critical. But on the other hand, like you talk about in the sales force or in the customer service force, if if you're not working well, if you don't have the skills to work well with your customer, you'll lose them. And maybe some little thing you said offhand remark could cause them to say, you know what, I need to leave this and go to that other company because they have the bigger machine, or they have the whatever machine that I saw on the commercial. And you lose a customer just like that.
Okay. So I have two, well, they're not really jokes, but they're very apropos for me. Do you know why I'm not a carpenter? Or actually, let me ask it differently. You know what my nickname would be if I was a carpenter?
What's that?
Stubbs.
Yeah, we all got our scars.
Yeah. And I'll tell a story on me. Again, it highlights the importance of being safe and thinking about what you're doing. When I was in metal shop, I had mastered quite a few things and done pretty well with things. But I was working with a cutting torch one day and my head itched. And I reached up with the hand that had the cutting torch in and scratched it and cut a big Z. And I wore short hair, and there's just like a big Z in the top of my hair where it was burned. And the instructor got a little excited and he said, what you can do for the rest of this class, you'll pass, but you can sit over there on that chair and read any book you want to read and just stay away from the stuff. Yeah. And I will talk briefly about safety in my industry. The one thing that we run into challenges with, and again, I'm telling a story on me because I am good about telling my stories, is that sometimes we need to be careful when we lift. And one day I was working with another technician. We were way behind. We're in a hurry, and we needed to it was like a mid-sized copier up into the bed of a pickup truck. Okay. So, you had two choices. You could set the copier on the tailgate and then get up and lift it up and set it in, or you could just reach it from the ground and put it in to the back of the truck. Guess which option we opted for? And I was the boss. I was in charge. And as I got it over there, I felt a pop in my back. And I spent the next 6 months, not lifting anything heavier than my coffee cup. So it's really a good example of how it doesn't matter what your job is. There are things that come up that you've got to really be safe with, and work on.
And really, safety mindset is really about paying attention to details. So in business, it's a lot of the same principles. That's why many times when I'm teaching about successful teams, I'm teaching about safety in the high risk industries. It's very similar principles. And so many of the principles that you talk about here with management on your podcast, on your interviews, is so apropos to both construction and manufacturing.
Yeah. All right. Well, you know what, John, I've enjoyed having you. We'll say goodbye to the audience. Next week, I have another interview. I will be at sea, but we will be doing the interview. If everything works, I'm going to be on the Emerald Princess saying hi to everybody. If you are listening to this on the podcast, or if you're listening or watching the replay, do me a favor and hit like and subscribe so that people know there's something worthwhile on the podcast. And we'll see everybody next week.
Goodbye.